1950s, psychiatry was dominated by psychoanalysis. If you were trained as a psychiatrist during that time, as Aaron Beck was, you were taught that depression came from deep unconscious conflicts. The goal of therapy was to uncover the hidden emotional forces buried deep in the psyche. And Beck believed this. In fact, he set out to prove Freud's theory of depression. Now, this is one of the favorite moments in the history of psychology because sometimes science advances when someone goes out to prove a theory and accidentally proves the opposite. At the University of Pennsylvania, Beck began studying depressed patients. His goal was to confirm the psychoanalytic idea that depression came from what Freud called inverted hostility, anger turned inward against the self. So Beck did what good researchers do. He collected data, he analyzed therapy sessions, he studied dream reports, he carefully tracked what patients were saying in session. But as the research unfolded, something strange kept happening. The data simply wasn't cooperating with Freud. Instead of uncovering hidden unconscious anger, Beck kept hearing something else entirely. His patients were describing a constant stream of thoughts like, "I'm a failure, I'm a mess, I'm gonna mess up everything, nothing is ever gonna get better." These thoughts weren't hidden, they weren't buried deep in the unconscious, they were right there on the surface, happening automatically throughout the day. Beck started calling them automatic thoughts, quick, reflexive interpretations people make about themselves and the world. And eventually, he would ask a question that would change psychotherapy. What if depression isn't primarily driven by unconscious conflict? What if it's driven by pattern of distorted thinking? Now, if you're Freud listening to this idea from beyond the grave, you're probably not thrilled. But from that moment forward, Beck began developing a completely different approach to therapy, one that focused not on uncovering hidden meanings, but on identifying, examining, and restructuring the thoughts that shape our emotional lives. The approach became cognitive therapy, which eventually evolved into what we now call cognitive behavioral therapy, or CBT. Today, CBT is one of the most researched and widely practiced therapies in the world, and it all started because psychiatrists tried to prove Freud right, and the data had other plans. Hey everyone, welcome back to Licensure Lifeline, the podcast where we break down the theories, concepts, and clinical skills you need to pass your licensing exams and become a stronger clinician along the way. If you're new to the show, my name is Matt Lawson. I'm a licensed professional counselor, and this podcast is designed to help you prepare for all the exams toward becoming a counselor. Because the reality is passing the exam is important, but understanding the ideas behind these theories is what actually makes you a better therapist. And that's really the direction I'm continuing to take this show in. Instead of just touching briefly on topics, these episodes are going to take you into like really deep dives and think about the theories and clinical frameworks that show up on the licensure exam. The goal is to help you understand not just what the answer is, but why the answer is. If you've been listening to the show for a while, you've probably heard me mention the Licensure Concierge app. That tool is designed to help counselors track licensure requirements, continued education, and renewal deadlines across different states. It's something that I built because honestly, the process of keeping up with licensure requirements can feel unnecessarily complicated. Lots of red tape there. So take a look when you get a chance. I will have the link to that in the show notes. I'm also continuing to work on the Licensure Lifeline community. So this will be an online private group for individuals that are working toward becoming therapists and people that are therapists. I'm going to have a lot of different resources in there, little quizzes. I'll do some different hostings around live events that include like study sessions, book clubs, things like that. And I'm really hoping to create just a nice little environment for therapists and people becoming therapists to come in and just get some support. I even have a section built in there that allows people just to complain if they want, or encourage, or, just talk about their experiences. All right. With that said, let's shift gears and take a look at what's happening in the news. All right. First up, A new report from the U.S. Surgeon General's office on loneliness and social isolation continues to ripple through the mental health field, with researchers warning of chronic loneliness maybe carrying health risks comparable to smoking 15 cigarettes a day. That statistic is something I hear a lot. I've heard a lot. I'm sure you have as well. This idea of just how significantly loneliness is impacting people. And, if you think about like isolation and, what is happening to a person in that state, they're not active. They're not out and about. They're not connecting with other people. Even with the most introverted individuals in our society, we all need some kind of connection, just something to kind of fill that part of our cup as a human being. And we're seeing more and more of just how negatively loneliness is impacting, and how more isolated than we are than ever before. But researchers are exploring interventions that focus not just on reducing symptoms like depression and anxiety, but rebuilding social infrastructures, things like community engagement, social prescribing, behavioral activation strategies that help people reconnect with others. And we do, like, as a society, I think we need more places that we can connect around. I think too much of our lives are spent commuting from one place to another, versus just having places that we can just stay and be social. Next up, insurance reimbursement for mental health is still lagging. This has been something that I have constantly seen through my years of being a therapist, going on almost 20 here. And it really is kind of sad. But a report from Millman, a major health consulting firm, found that mental health providers are still reimbursed significantly less than medical specialists for comparable services. The report showed that mental health clinicians are reimbursed around 20 to 30% less on average than primary care physicians for similar appointment lengths. Because of this, many therapists choose to move toward private pay models, which can increase access for patients who rely on insurance. And again, something you're seeing a lot of right now in therapy is so many practices, so many private practices are going toward cash pay models. It's becoming the only places that you're seeing insurance being taken are like hospitals, or really big organizations that can, afford to kind of wait on the reimbursement. And it's really kind of sad. And, as clinicians, again, we need to advocate for ourselves. We need to look at the different representatives that are around that are supporting mental health, and, contact them, stand up for our profession, stand up for what we're doing, and stand up for the people that really need us. All right, that's going to be it for the news. Let's get on to the main topic. We are getting into Aaron Beck today. So, if Freud gave us one of the earliest systemic models of the mind, Aaron Beck helped shift psychotherapy towards something much more observable and testable: the role that thought patterns play in emotional distress. And, I can't stress this enough. It's really interesting how psychotherapy shifted as we got more into the cognitive behavioral type approaches. And, kind of before this, with psychoanalyst being like pretty prominent in the field, if not most of the field, all the field. And they kind of worked a lot of the times from this place of, they kind of held all the cards. And, it was all about the person coming in and them figuring out what was, I'm putting air quotes up here, wrong with the individual through psychoanalysis. And, with this shift, it kind of put a little bit more onus on the individual, kind of started to really work that relationship between the patient and the individual. But one of the core ideas behind Beck's work is actually pretty simple. Our emotional experiences are heavily influenced by how we interpret events, not just by events themselves. Two people can experience the exact same situation. One person feels discouraged and defeated, while another person feels motivated to try again. And this is a powerful concept, something I use regularly. to kind of, explore pieces and areas and situations with individuals. Being able to just get them to reframe and kind of look through different lenses of, what's occurring to them, what they perceive as occurring to them. So the difference here is, according to Beck, the answer often lies in the thoughts that happen in between the events and the emotion. This is the foundation of cognitive therapy. Cognitive model. Beck proposed what we now call the cognitive model of emotional response. The model looks like this: situation leads to thought, leads to emotion, leads to behavior. In everyday life, we often assume emotions come directly from events. An example here: I failed an exam, therefore I feel depressed. But Beck pointed out something important. There's an actual interpretation step happening between these two things, right? So it really looks more like this: situation, I failed the exam; thought, I'm a failure and I'll never become a counselor; emotion, depression or hopelessness. So you see, you see where the opportunity is to really explore some of those inner workings, some of that inner dialogue that the person is talking about in session, right? Um, what are the thoughts between I failed the exam and depression and um, you know some people will, not go to the depression place, and their thought might be, what can I learn from this exam? What can I learn from not passing this exam? And does it make them depressed, and maybe they actually feel a little bit more hopeful? And that becomes like how we help individuals kind of reframe some of these things in their lives. So thinking stuff like, I failed the exam, I didn't prepare well enough this time, you know, falling into disappointment, but also some motivation, right? So again, like a different reframe as well here. So um, once you start seeing this pattern, though, you start realizing something Beck discovered very quickly in therapy. People often have habitual ways of interpreting events that shape their emotional life. These things are learned. These ways of thinking about things are learned. These ways of interpreting things are learned. That means they can be unlearned. One of Beck's most important um, contributions, was identifying something he called automatic thoughts. Automatic thoughts are these knee-jerk, reflexive kind of thoughts that we have, right? They appear so quickly that people often assume they're simply facts about the reality rather than an interpretation. For example, someone might walk into a room where coworkers stop talking. The automatic thought might be, "Oh, they're probably talking about me." That thought may appear instantly, just reflexively. And once that thought appears, emotions follow quickly behind it. Maybe anxiety, embarrassment, and anger. Beck noticed that depressed patients tend to have a very predictable automatic thoughts, often centered around themes like I'm not good enough, I'm a failure, nothing ever works out for me. These thoughts become mental habits, and those habits shape emotional experiences. This is just, this was really freeing for me when I learned it, that the control that I have over any situation, over any moment in my life, comes down to the way I interpret that moment. It was like this amazing, and it's funny because I didn't quite get this until I read some of Albert Ellis's stuff, father of our rationally motive behavior therapy, right? Which is a branch of CBT, and they all kind of mix together, right? But I didn't quite get it until I read one of his books, and it just hit me. I was like, oh my gosh, I actually have control over this. And this is one of the gifts that we can give people, is to just show them like, hey, you actually have more control over the interpretation of this situation than you think. This is what you're interpreting. You're interpreting danger. You're interpreting pain, but can I invite you to just look through a little bit of a different lens here? All right, let's talk the cognitive triad. One of the most important concepts for licensing exams, clinical practice is Beck's cognitive triad. The cognitive triad describes three patterns of negative thinking commonly seen in depression. So, first up, negative view of self, I'm worthless. Negative view of the world, everything is unfair. And negative view of the future, things will never get better. If you remember nothing else about Beck on this exam, remember this triad: self, world, future, SWF. Self, world, future. When someone is depressed, all three lenses become distorted at the same time. The triad becomes a kind of self reinforced loop. Negative thoughts about the self lead to negative interpretations of the event, which reinforce a belief that future will remain negative. Do you see how that works? Again, do you see how we shape our experiences? We shape, how we come out of those experiences. I always give this example to people, and it's something that I think a lot of individuals can relate to, but that idea of, you can see two people walking in a bar and one person bumps shoulders with another and they get really upset. It's like almost like they're ready to fight. And another person can bump into somebody else and they're like, hey, slap them on the back. Let me buy you a drink. Come on over. It's all about how we choose to frame that moment. One person decides to frame it as a threat. The other person decides to frame it as an invitation. But we have that choice. We all have that choice. But it just depends on what we were taught. And, working on these things, we can teach people a different way. Beck also described deeper structures beneath automatic thoughts called core beliefs. Core beliefs are deeply held assumptions about the self and the world. Examples include: I'm unlovable, I must be perfect to be accepted, the world is dangerous. These beliefs often develop early in life and then shape how people interpret later experiences. Automatic thoughts are like surface level reactions, while core beliefs are underlying frameworks generating these reactions. A helpful way to think about it is: automatic thoughts are the leaves on the tree, core beliefs are the roots underground. Therapy often involves identifying and challenging both levels. Let's talk cognitive distortions. This is one of my favorite areas. And I always forget the cognitive distortions. And it's funny because I'll like bring them up in session and then I'll immediately not remember any of them every single time. Beck also identified some common patterns of faulty thinking known as cognitive distortions. These are systematic errors in thinking that reinforce negative emotions. Some of the most common distortions include all or nothing thinking. I failed this test, so I'm terrible at counseling. Catastrophizing. This is a big one. People catastrophize all the time. I catastrophize all the time. And again, if helping people get these things under control can just be a great gift. Mind reading. This is another one. I do this. Mind reading comes up a lot when I do couples counseling. They think I'm incompetent. Overgeneralization. This happened once, so it'll always happen. These distortions show up frequently in licensure exam questions, especially when you're asked to identify what kind of thinking pattern a client is demonstrating. All right, so that's going to be it for like Beck's main topics. Let's get into some questions. All right, question number 1. A counselor working from a cognitive therapy perspective believes that a client's emotional distress is primarily the result of A, unresolved unconscious conflicts, B, learned behavioral responses, C, distorted or maladaptive thinking patterns, or D, environmental reinforced patterns. The correct answer is C, distorted or maladaptive thinking patterns. So Beck's cognitive model emotional reactions are influenced by how individuals interpret events rather than events themselves. Cognitive therapy focuses on identifying and restructuring distorted thinking patterns that contribute to emotional distress. You may notice option A reflects psychoanalytical theory, while option B and D lean more toward behaviorism. Question number 2. Aaron Beck's cognitive triad refers to negative views about which three areas? Is it A, past, present, and future, B, self, world, and future. C, self, family, and society. Or D, thoughts, emotions, and behaviors. Answer is B, self, world, and the future. I I've seen this question set up just like this on the test, where it does this exact same thing. So, you know, any little mnemonic that you can come up with to help you remember that self, world, future, SWF, like, yes, it's going to help. All right, question number 3. The client states, I failed one exam, which means I'll probably never succeed as a counselor. This statement is best describes which cognitive distortion. Is it A, mind reading, B, overgeneralization, C, emotional reasoning, or D, personalization? Answer for this one's going to be B. Overgeneralization occurs when someone draws a broad negative conclusion from a single event. In this example, the client takes one failed exam and interprets it as proof of lifelong failure. Question number 4. In cognitive therapy, automatic thoughts are best described as A, deep unconscious motivations, B, habitual interpretations that occur quickly and reflexively, C, beliefs developed during early childhood, or D, thoughts produced during dream analysis. The correct answer is B, habitual interpretations that occur quickly and reflexively. Automatic thoughts are rapid, they're spontaneous, they're reflexive. They occur so quickly that individuals often accept them as just fact, rather than interpretations, which a lot of the times they are. Question number 5. Which of the following best reflects the primary goal of cognitive therapy? Is it A, uncover unconscious conflicts, B, reinforce adaptive behaviors through conditioning, C, identify and modify distorted thinking patterns, or D, encourage emotional catharsis? The correct answer is C, identify and modify distorted thinking patterns. The goal of cognitive therapy is to help clients recognize and evaluate their thoughts, then replace those distorted interpretations with more balanced and realistic thinking. Last question. Question number 6. A therapist asks a client what evidence supports that thought and what evidence might suggest a different interpretations. This intervention is most consistent with what type of therapeutic technique? Is it A, dream analysis, B, cognitive restructuring, C, free association, or D, exposure therapy? We didn't talk very much about this, but the answer is going to be B. Cognitive restructuring involves helping clients evaluate the accuracy of their thoughts and develop alternative interpretations. This process helps weaken maladaptive thinking patterns and contribute to emotional distress. And moving on to a vignette. David is a 35-year-old man who presents to counseling reporting persistent feelings of sadness, fatigue, and discouragement that have been present for several months. He reports difficulty concentrating at work and states that he often feels overwhelmed by beliefs he is failing both professionally and personally. David recently received critical feedback from his supervisor regarding a project he completed. Although the feedback was mostly constructive, David reports that since the meeting, he has become convinced that he is going to lose his job. He says, I knew it was only a matter of time before they figured out I'm not good enough for this position. David reports spending hours replaying the meeting in his mind and imagining future scenarios in which he is fired and unable to find another position. He has begun to withdraw from coworkers and avoids meetings whenever possible. During the session, David states, honestly, this always happens. I try something and eventually it falls apart. It's just proof that I'm not cut out for success. David denies suicidal ideation, but reports feeling increasingly hopeless about the future. All right, sounds like David is really struggling here. So, with this vignette, before we even look at the answers, ask what theory does this vignette point toward? In this case, we see repetitive negative thoughts interpretation of events, distorted conclusions, hopelessness about the future. Those clues should immediately make you think about Aaron Beck and cognitive therapy. Exams, they often reward you for just recognizing the theoretical lens first that you're going to be looking through, to really take the vignette and the situation apart. So let's look for the cognitive distortions here. What thinking errors are present? David shows several classic distortions. He's catastrophizing, believes that constructive feedback means he will lose his job. He's doing some mind reading here, assuming that the supervisor thinks he's incompetent. He's doing some overgeneralization. This always happens. You see the cognitive triad showing up here as well: negative view of self, negative view of the world, the future. When you hear multiple distortions like this, that again reinforces that cognitive therapy is going to be something that is going to be very useful. Let's answer some questions here. Which cognitive distortion is most evident in David's statement? This always happens to me. I try something and eventually it falls apart. Is that going to be overgeneralization, personalization, emotional reasoning, or selective abstraction? What do you think? All right, this one's going to be overgeneralization. David is drawing a broad global conclusion based on limited evidence, which is the definition of overgeneralization. Question 2. Which intervention would be most consistent with Beck's cognitive therapy? Would exploration of unresolved childhood conflict, identifying and challenge the accuracy of David's thoughts, encourage emotional catharsis, or use exposure therapy to reduce anxiety? Answer to this one's going to be the second one: identify and challenge the accuracy of David's thoughts. So, it is like picking these vignettes apart. They make it, I don't want to say obvious, but they don't try to trick you. They really present things that will stand out as cognitive behavior therapy, psychoanalysis, things like that, that are just pretty cut and dry, and point to the modality that's going to be used. Okay, folks, that's going to be it for the episode. Let's take a moment and bring everything together. We explored the work of Aaron Beck today, one of the most influential figures in modern psychotherapy and the founder of cognitive therapy. We talked about how Beck challenged the dominant psychoanalytical thinking of his time and began focusing instead on the role of automatic thoughts and belief systems in shaping emotional experiences. And there are a few key ideas from Beck's work that are especially important to remember for licensing exams. First up, Beck's cognitive model reminds us that it's not just events themselves that shape emotions, it's the interpretation of those events. Secondly, we discussed automatic thoughts, those quick knee-jerk type thoughts that people have, that are just accepted as fact versus an opinion about the reality in the moment. And lastly, we looked at Beck's cognitive triad, the pattern of negative thinking often seen in depression: negative view of self, negative view of the world, negative view of the future. CBT is an incredibly useful framework for working with individuals. It really does give a nice, just cut and dry support for people in just the way that they think, their inner dialogue, and how that really impacts their lives. Check out the Beck Institute. I've actually taken some classes there. It's run by Aaron Beck's daughter and her daughter the last time I checked. So Aaron Beck's daughter and granddaughter. And they, I remember I took a class there, I think around eating disorders, I believe at the time, or disordered eating. But definitely check that out. And if you found this episode helpful, make sure to follow the podcast so you don't miss future episodes. And please pass this along to other clinicians and people that are studying toward becoming therapists. I love getting the notes all the time about how helpful the podcast was and how people are just passing the test. It's so good to hear, because this should be the last thing that therapists should have to worry about toward becoming therapist. Just getting through these tests, and I'm hoping that I'm making it just a little bit easier for everyone. But keep listening, and until next time, keep learning. Take care.